Hello and welcome to the Michael Mamas Show. I'm your host, Michael Mamas, and we're coming to you from Mount Soma, home of the Sri Someshwara Temple in the mountains of Western North Carolina. And today is a special day. It's the finals. This is probably the number one biggest tennis match in the world for the year. It's the finals at Wimbledon in England. And some interesting guys are playing. Djokovic, who's 36 years old. He's won more majors than anybody, and now he's going for another one if he wins today. And he's playing a 20-year-old Alvarez, who's 21-year-old kid from Spain, and he's already at his age playing better than Djokovic or any of them. McEnroe, you name them, Federer, Nadal. And so the potential is huge. The match is huge. And prior to that, they played in the final. The two of them played in the final at the French Open. And first set or two were incredibly good. And then Alcaraz just cramped up, which couldn't have been from exhaustion. It was not that far into the match. So evidently it was just from nerves, which is really throws a twist into the whole thing. But that's the thing I love about tennis. One of the many things I love about watching professional tennis is you get to know the characters because they're up close. You see the expressions on their face after they hit every ball. And then they interview them and you follow them all through their careers. You get to know them. It's a great sport. And even to play tennis, there's a mind-body integration, all the different shots. There's a finesse to it. You don't, there's a refinement to it in the sense that you're not beating up one another, and that kind of thing, But Scotty, you watch. Are you going to watch the match today? You think?
Yeah, I'll probably watch it for sure.
Yeah, I
But
know a lot of people will have it on while they're doing other things. That kind of includes me, though
yeah,
sometimes I regret it because you miss a lot
but
when you do that.
what's interesting is I was having a discussion yesterday about, and when you just said about where the 20-year-old kid is starting out and he's better, arguably could be better right now. Maybe he doesn't have the experience, but I've been watching as we were talking about the Tour de France too, and
Yeah,
all
because you're
these
a
guys.
bicycler. You bicycle.
Yeah,
What is it? 120 miles you've done in a day?
yeah, I've done like a Grand Fondo, which is like 120. It was like 120 miles, yeah, but
Wow.
nowhere near to the level that these guys do. Because I have had it's been great because I've been to the Tour de France like a few times to be there in person.
You were
But
there?
yeah, yeah, I've been
Really?
there like 3 times.
What's that like when you
Um,
when you're actually watching them in person?
it's always best, I think, to be at the finish, because otherwise it's like if you're out there on the course, they go by in like 1 second and you don't see it. It's one of those that's better to watch on TV than it is in
But
person.
what do you gain by being there in person?
Well, that most people don't understand is that there's like a traveling, like party, like parade that goes along with it. So, like as they go along France, wherever they go, they have this huge caravan of like parade vehicles, all these things that come in to like put the barriers up. So there's like a million people that travel from town to town
Really? Really?
and get
Well,
ready for the end of the next, they start from the place and then they take off immediately and go get set up at the end, and then what
really?
right
For
before
the
they come in, yeah,
for the next town or whatever?
yeah, whenever they're gonna end the next race, they have a whole parade set up. So before the whole group comes in to finish, there's a giant parade where all the sponsors are throwing out things off of like floats, like you'd see in a parade. It's amazing, and
There's
I
there's
don't
a
think
there's
most
there's a be Go ahead.
no, there's like over a billion people around the world that watch that, and it goes on for 21 days. It's like most people, they don't even understand that it's like the biggest live sporting event in the world, bar none.
I didn't
Because the
know
Super
all
Bowl's
that.
one day.
I thought soccer
Um,
was, you know.
Soccer, still you've got, you may have more people on one day watching it, but you don't have a billion people every day for 20 days watching the race. You know, you know what I'm saying? It's like there's that
Let
many
alone the
people.
athletes that can keep that up for 21 days or whatever it is.
Yeah, and that's what we're talking about too, is like the level, like the
Incredible.
time the
Yeah, you were saying no
time
other
that the
athlete in
people are.
any other sport could keep up. What?
There's no other professional athlete that could stay in that race from beginning to end. They might not even last one day, let alone 21 days, because there's a time, um,
And boy,
there's
that's,
a
I mean,
time requirement.
you got soccer players who have incredible endurance, but not for 21 days in a row.
No way. They may be lucky to pick the right stage to last one day, but you're talking about riding what they call full gas for 6 hours, 4 to 6 hours,
There,
4 to 6 hours.
there's so much I love about, yeah, there's so much I love about sports. For one, just the potential of human physiology and how they
Yeah,
push it to such refined and great extremes in so many different ways. I mean, you got pole vaulters, you got Tour de France, you got tennis, all these different sports,
yeah,
and there's a purity to it. There's an exquisiteness to sports. You know, I think
yeah.
some people, oh, they don't have much interest in sports. I've heard them say that because it's like, who cares? I care, and I care a lot. You know, if for nothing else, just as a salute to the human potential and the focus and
Well,
the dedication that's required in these. And it's interesting that so often, I'm not saying across the board, but so often, uh, I want to say almost always, the characters, the athletes, the more you hear them interviewed and seen, especially in tennis, when it's so much just so up close and personal, you know, they're just great human beings. I mean, they just strike me as great human beings. Even though as viewers, we create our biases and our preferences. And a lot of people, for example, don't like Djokovic. I think he's a great man, you know. It's always hard for me to understand how people, you know, would develop a bias, but I guess that's sports and that's the nature of the human persona, you know.
I think it's also embodying something that needs to be adopted across society, which is taking your craft and seeking to be better and better and better at it all the time, if that makes
I
sense.
agree with that. I agree with that. And they're so dedicated and it's such a pure thing. I mean, it's all about the relationship of their mind with their body and refining all of that and developing that. There's some sports that I think are, you know, I'm going to show a bias here, but some of them they're just too crude, you know, and they
Yeah.
abuse the bodies too much. But I'm not a big, huge fan of those sports.
But yeah, and what's interesting too is that they were talking about this guy that used to be on top of the sport in the cycling world, and he had an accident, and they had an interview with the guy, and he's like, "Well, I'm trying to get back to my best form," and one of the guys said, "Well, the guys that are at the head of the group now are so far ahead of where he was. If he gets back to where he was before, he's already left behind."
You know, and that's
He,
so true. Like even in tennis, now part of it was
yeah,
because they
that's
got
what.
better tennis rackets now, and you know the equipment has changed. Uh, 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 but there's the skill level is constantly improving. Especially, I
Yeah,
think as a sport like tennis got so much more recognized over the past decades, becomes more
correct.
competitive. But you know, who knows how good they'll get? And you watch a guy like Djokovic play, and it's like, how could anybody get better?
Right.
It's also very interesting to me that even at that level, the things that kick in. I used to play just in the public tennis courts in the neighborhood, and it was interesting there because even so, the better players would get together and compete, and we all know who is better than whom, and if you beat somebody that was considered better than you, it was kind of spread through the neighborhood. But the point being, at that level, you get nervous and you can't serve right or your game goes off. But you would think, just speaking innocently, that at some level they'd get so good that the nerves wouldn't be as much of a factor, but they absolutely are. Of course, the stakes are a lot higher too. But and here's the thing too about sports, and I probably talked about this in a podcast, but I think it's worth talking about. Um, it's not uncommon for players to pray to God for their team to win or for them to win as individuals or whatever, and you'll hear criticism about that because people will say, "Well, what makes you think God's going to be on your side?" And would God really play favorites, and prefer one player to the next? That's not the point. That's not how it works. Because you see, there are all kinds of levels of divinity, you could say. And in India, it's not at all uncommon for a village to have their own aspect of Mahalakshmi, for example, their own aspect of Mother Divine. That is like the goddess for that village. And every tree has a deva, or has a corresponding personified correlate. It's a nature of it. When really what that's about is it's about the group goes, and that creates a dynamic. That group and so what's really happening there is they are with Zeus, just mythology. No, no, no. Those two are embodiments of nature. And for example, see, in the Vedic tradition, what we're talking about with Veda is the nature of nature, the nature of the underlying basis of existence. And there's a mechanic there. There's a mechanic there, and each different component, if you will, to the mechanism. I mean, even the word yantra, this translates machine. There's a mechanic to the underlying structure of existence. And the Sri Yantra, which is the yantra that holds all other yantras, if you will, you pulled out these different yantra values. We're pulling out different components to the mechanics of nature itself. And so now when you have these different mythologies, they're not really, some of them are, but a lot of them aren't really mythologies. They're personified correlates to different aspects of the mechanics. And it could be a combination of different mechanics, if you will, kind of working together in a symphony to create a certain value that has a personified correlate. And so, Zeus and those ancient Greek gods, for example, the ancient Egyptian gods also, that's what they are. But what happens is as the cultural integrity of a nation or of a culture uh, uh, wanes, as it comes to an end, then those values cease to be enlivened, and it's as if those gods go to sleep. They're still there, they're just asleep. And so by re-enlivening that cultural integrity, you, if you will, we could say it this way, you reawaken those gods, you see? And that's just physics, that's just the nature of existence. And that's really it's kind of like the topic of this podcast, isn't it? The whole thing with uh, what people believe in. Like, for example, you see, every culture gets arrogant about, they've got finally figured out the right gods, the real gods, or they figured out the real relationship with existence. Even today, the physicists, oh, we got it figured out. And if people just all thought the way we thought, the world would be fine, which everybody thinks to some extent. Wouldn't it be a strange world if everybody in the world agreed with everything you thought and said, change everything? But it doesn't work that way. And because the nature of the relative is relative, it's rooted in duality, polarity, polarization, perspective, you see, always really saying different ways of saying the same thing. So even the physicists, it's really interesting. It's really interesting. There's some theorems out there in modern physics. Modern physics got really sidetracked for the past 100 years, really. Just like Maharshi said, he said they have all the right formulas, they just don't understand them. And they've really gone off on tangents with them. Bell's theorem, for example, the idea that two subatomic particles can be connected. And so no matter how far apart they are, if something happens to this one, it instantaneously happens with the other one. So if you look at the experiment itself and how it was done, finding that was more a function of the machinery, the mechanic, the laboratory tool that they used that caused them to misinterpret what was really going on there. It was really just classical physics. It was Bell's theorem, it just wasn't there. Also, with the James Webb Telescope, they're looking out there, they're seeing that there are galaxies older than the Big Bang Theory would allow for. And it's really, both those things have really upset a lot of physicists that dedicated their life to Bell's theorem or dedicated their life to the Big Bang Theory. And you would think, okay, if people are dedicated to a particular God, it might be hard to let go of and stuff, but you would think physicists who are rational beings would see that and say, oh, okay, well, drop back and punt. We got it wrong. But they're so identified with their worldview. And I mean, they vested their life in it, so it's understandable. But nevertheless, even at that level of intellectual prowess, they can't let it go. And so that's the history of humanity, really. All the different religions, all the different cultures, all the different superstitions that creep into different cultures. And then the tendency then to take a great knowledge and throw out the baby with the bathwater because superstition has crept in, which is a shame. And so the mechanic, see, that's the beauty of Vedic cognition, is that it came from a place of a time of great purity in nature and in the physiology of people, where the really spiritual leaders, the rishis we call them, which they too are really woven into the fabric of Chaitanya, of the Absolute, but nevertheless they brought out the knowledge in its pure state, which is abstract. So you can't pick up a copy of the Vedas and read it, and now you get the Vedas, because now it's an abstract language, and it easily slips through the fingers. But nevertheless, the understanding is there. And of course, then superstition creeps in, and different beliefs creep in, and then Hinduism, which is rooted in Vedic, has its different branches. a number of them, let's face it, rooted in superstitions or misinterpretations, misunderstandings of the Vedic knowledge. So people throw out the baby with the bathwater on that, and okay, Hinduism is wrong, forget the Veda, blah blah. It's a terrible loss. So the question then becomes, as the title of this podcast, what is a barbarian? What is a barbarian? By and large, I think people view barbarians as anybody that doesn't think the same way they do. I mean, even in politics today, the Democrats look at the Republicans as barbarians in a sense. The Republicans look at the Democrats as barbarians in a sense. Different cultures look at other cultures, barbarians. The Muslims might look at the Christians as barbarians. The Christians look at the Muslims as barbarians. Everybody's a barbarian, from the perspective of another. And so, is there any bottom line? Is there any absolute value to the foundation of existence, which there is, or is it all just relative? See, the relative is relative, but it emerged out of that field of perfection, the birth of right out of pure consciousness, the self-interacting dynamic of pure consciousness. It's a field of perfection, and then the echoes that emerge out of perfection to create not oneness, but polarization and bias, really. The field of imperfection is birthed out of a field of perfection, you see. It's a misunderstanding. It's called Maya, illusion. Pragya Parat, mistake of the intellect, all those ideas. And by the way, even physics as we understand it today, that's a small category, subcategory in the Veda. It's there, it's understood, it's described in detail, but it's not the whole thing. It's a small subcategory of the bigger picture, you see. The Veda is pure nature. It's nature itself. You see, our own nature, human nature, mother nature, global nature, universal nature, you see? And so a barbarian is anybody who functions in a manner that's not in accord with that. So in that sense, we're all barbarians. This is the field of imperfection, the relative. But there are different degrees of barbarism, But the point is that, every generation, every 10 years, look at our value systems now with respect to, say, cultural integrity, as opposed to our value system regarding cultural integrity just a couple decades ago, a few decades ago, a handful of decades ago. People of that era would look at how we're thinking now and call us barbarians. We look back at that time and say, oh, geez, Americans sure were barbarians, weren't they, 30, 40 years ago? So the whole thing is just not clearly in an integrated way rooted to our own true nature. Oh, it's loosely tethered. If it wasn't at least loosely tethered, we'd be dead. It's the source of coherence and harmony and integration in life. It's always rooted in that, in the absolute, Chaitanya, Bhavatitam, the absolute, and even a lot of those principles in physics, this is really very interesting, because where does knowledge come from? It comes from deep within. We observe the environment and we create understandings and rules of life based upon those observations, and that's looking outward. But really, there's a deeper principle even with that, is because how we evaluate those outer realities is based upon going inward and using our intuition, using our own feelings, extreme examples of it are like the guy who came up with the benzene ring. He found that within himself, and then, oh yeah, there it is on the surface. You know, a lot of examples like that. But really, everything's like that. 2 + 2 = 4 is because it's reasonable, and reason is that thing that links the deeper sense of our being with the superficial intellect. Reason is that field of integration between the two. You see. So anyway, all these things, we could go on forever. But there's a principle here that I'd like to speak of, and I've talked about it before. It's called mapping, and how things map, and the abstraction through which things map, and how a lot of them aren't even provable or documentable in the field of, for example, physics, because the abstraction is there in a way, and there's so many multiple variables that we can't even isolate it into a laboratory where we can test it out. And so much of knowledge lies beyond the grasp of physics, really. And that's why this Vedic cognition is of value. But because we are so indoctrinated into thinking in a way based on our current, barbaric society, forgive me, it illustrates a point, I think. We look at principles like mapping, and we just, oh, you can't really believe that. And just to give some extreme examples, they say that, there's the operators in the unified field, and the grahas, the different planets, one of which is Saturn. And those are mechanics. They're like different operators within the mechanic of the unified field, the absolute. And one of them is Saturn. And talking about an abstract mapping here, one way to appease Saturn, to work with Saturn, to integrate your life with the laws of nature embodied by Saturn, is to feed crows on Saturday. Now, people who are identified with a particular paradigm look at that, and what do they say? Oh, barbarians. How can anybody believe that? Or another very interesting mapping is the idea that cows, if reincarnate as Brahmins, and if you slaughter cows, you damage their nervous system, and so when they reincarnate, what you end up with is a bunch of Brahmins with damaged nervous systems. I don't mean to get too presumptuous here, but it makes you wonder about academia today, because Brahmins aren't just priests and pundits, they're also the scholars, the academicians, something like that. But see, these are mappings, and I'll tell you, even people that have studied with me for years and come to understand all this stuff, and I think a number of people that even come to the Hindu temples, the Vedic temples, they can't grasp it. It's like superstition, and I'm not saying all of them, some, but these things are so distant from what we've been indoctrinated into believing that we just don't believe it. And it's a shame, because the knowledge is there in its purity, So moving on from that, and I mean, this is something, okay, you heard it, you get it. It's one thing to get it intellectually. It's another thing to really find it within yourself. But I think the more you live and breathe this and work with it, the more you start to realize, man, this is truth. There's reality there. But it takes time. It takes time, Even the whole field of how our gut level feelings, which is, as Maharishi Patanjali, the word for that is intuition. Intuition is translated as, oftentimes, the Vedic word is often translated as gut feeling. And so the question is our gut feeling rooted in the depth of our being, which is, where things become reasonable and then manifest out as concrete thoughts? Are those gut feelings coming from the depth of our being, or are they coming from some superficial indoctrination, which is the roots of barbarianism, right? So, having said all of that, getting into the just some other points that have come up through the weekend, different thoughts and stuff. The notion of commitment. What does it really mean to be committed to something? A lot of people, I think, claim to be committed, and they are to some degree. But what is real commitment? To really be committed, like, I'm all in for Mount Soma. I mean, I believe in the Vedic knowledge and this idea of building an enlightened city, and that's what I'm committed to. That's why I built Mount Soma. We got a long ways to go. It takes a lot of money. And we're trying to raise those funds through donations or what have you. But it's so much money. We're going to need some really big donors to step forward and fund the thing. But the point is, commitment really means that there's no need for any options. There's no fallback. There's no, well, if this doesn't work out, I'll go do that. And okay, I'm in, but just with one foot or just my big toe. But I'm going to hold back, But to really be committed is a rare thing. Even these days, to be committed to a marriage or a relationship. It's yeah, well, and that's not really a union. That's not really a marriage, is it? So commitment is a great thing, and it's a very powerful thing. We choose wisely, of course, but once we make that commitment, once we move forward, you're still functioning in a world of imperfection. This is the relative after all. You may see the absolute in the eyes of your children, but they're human beings and they have their own personalities, and we all, our spouse as well. You love them because you see the perfection that's rooted deep within them through them. But nevertheless, on the more superficial levels of life, they're not perfect. But commitment means dedicated to that communion and moving forward no matter what. Not with options always held in your back pocket just in case, so you can bail out anytime you need to. That's not real commitment, is it? Another point. When somebody is angry or when they're yelling, by definition, they're out of balance. Now you might say, well, some of the gods got angry. That's a whole different matter. They're functioning from within the absolute field of perfection. But we are human beings. We have personalities. We have the whole spectrum of levels of existence of emotions and all of our wounds and biases. When somebody is yelling, when somebody is angry, they are out of balance. Just take it as guaranteed. Okay. And so if you want to, and people feel it. I don't think many people say that guy's yelling, he's out of balance. They don't, but really that they feel that. And so and why do people yell? Because they want to be heard. But when somebody hears you yelling like that, they can feel there's an imbalance there, even if they don't concretely, I call it, oh, that's an imbalance. They feel it. So it undermines your credibility. And so your desire to really be heard, which compels you to maybe to yell, undermines the underlying motivation, which is to be heard. So if you can be passionate about something, but you can keep a steady hand on the rudder, as I like to say, maintain your balance and speak from a place of balance, even about things you're passionate about, you will be heard a lot better than if you just get all bent out of shape. So and it's good to keep in mind, if you're angry, if you're yelling, you're out of balance. If somebody over there is angry and they're yelling, they're out of balance. And at times like that, the best thing to do is try to get balanced. Maybe help them find balance, maybe find balance within yourself, which might even be, for the time being, just say, okay, we'll talk about this another time. Go take a shower, go take a walk, have a bowl of ice cream, something, but regain balance. And then you can speak from a wiser place of wisdom, you see? Most conflicts, if you really think about it, they're not about the superficial situation that people are conflicted about, arguing about, in disagreement about. Because think about it. what's really underlying that is just a tangible feeling of the instability or the compromise of the feelings between the two people. If you're feeling negatively towards somebody, then almost anything they do, if you're feeling negatively enough, anything they do, you spin it in a way that makes them a bad guy. Whereas if there's a feeling of connection and camaraderie with that person, almost anything they do, you understand, and don't judge them in the same way. There was a great quote. I think I even had it here. Yeah, I don't see it. Anyway, there's some nice, concise quotes about that. So these are just things to think about. They're in my podcast notes. So you can go to, michaelmamas.net and read the notes as a refresher if you're listening to this podcast. The other thing, we've talked about this before, and it fits into this whole discussion, so I'll mention again this idea of framing. We frame things in a certain way, and particularly if our physiology is off, or if we're stressed, if we're tired, if we're feeling negative in general, then we tend to frame things in a negative manner. And there's a thing, I never considered this a very good word for it, but I would call it psychophysiological, I call it base note, maybe Achilles heel would be a better way to put it. Whereas when we are stressed, when we are out of balance, there's a particular place each individual tends to collapse. Some people collapse into fear, some people collapse into anger, some people collapse into sorrow. And so from that place, we frame a situation in that context. It's not like that's where we collapse down into, and it becomes a habit. When something's not right, when we're not right, and when a situation's not right, when we go into conflict, what do? We collapse down into that negative place, and we frame the thing there. And then what do? We start to rationalize it. Oh, they did this, and therefore that supports what I'm seeing. And and then they said this, and so see, that's more proof. And that's all noise, but that's the nature of projection. We project, we don't perceive the universe, the world, our environment, others. We project onto them. And it's based on that deeper feeling, what we feel our connection with that thing is. And that even goes to studying arithmetic, studying math. Some people study math and their relationship with it is, I'm overwhelmed, I can't handle it, oh, this is horrible. Other people have a math problem and they can't figure it out, or a principle in the math, they don't understand it. What do? They attack. I want to understand that. Very different relationships with the same dynamic, you see. So relationship with is everything. And take a look at the nature of your relationship with everything, including your friends, your spouse, your life, your world. And we do well if we get to a place where we spontaneously go into a positive framing. It's all framing anyway. Positive framings can feed, negative framings can destroy. And positive doesn't mean to say, oh, that's all love and light and it's all wonderful. A positive framing can be, well, how can we constructively work with this thing to make it better? As opposed to, stomping your feet and pounding your fists and saying, I hate you, I got to get out of here, type of a thing. Popularity, just real quick, it's in my notes. Popularity is oftentimes attained by meeting people on the level they want to be met upon. Whereas truth has more to do with alignment with one's own true nature, one's own deeper nature. And, a lot of spiritual teachers and people in all different branches of life, but spiritual teachers as an example, they give people a spiritual perspective that they can resonate with, and that makes them popular and considered great spiritual leaders. Whereas really they're just, doing the spiritual cha-cha. There are very few spiritual teachers out there that will really give it to you straight. And because if they did, you wouldn't want it anyway, you know. But I don't consider spiritual cha-cha teachers real teachers, you know. Somebody asked a question. This was interesting. Um, they said, "What's the difference between soul and spirit?" All right. First of all, what is soul? The absolute is beyond relative, so you can't touch it, you can't grab onto it, you can't taste it, you can't smell it. It's the absolute. But as it wells up through the different levels of our being, it becomes something tangible, and that you can feel, that you can experience within your own self, uh, uh, and that then the emergence of it is through your physiology. That's what we call the soul. You feel your soul. It's like the sun. You can't touch the sun, but you come to know its nature by virtue of the influence it has on the environment and how it feels when the sun shines. Uh, so that's what soul is. Spirit is another thing. Spirit is kind of like, we can have different definitions for it. We can use we use the word in different ways, don't we? But I think commonly spirit is sort of like the underlying mechanic of nature, still within the relative, but on a deep level, and we can kind of feel that and see it orchestrating existence and life and our lives, and we call that spirit. Spirit certainly flows through us, but we would also say that it permeates the whole environment. Okay. Um, and then this person asked about this experience of no mind. By the way, any questions you have or any topics you want me to talk about, doesn't even have to be in context of the podcast I just did, but if you go to michaelmamas.net and you look at it, any blog, there's a place there, comment. And you just click that, and you can make a comment. You could ask a question about something totally unrelated if you want. And a lot of times then, I may not even post them as comments because some of them, they may not make sense in that context. But I'll that's where this came from, and I'm happy to. Or actually, this came from another email, but nevertheless, a lot of what I do is based on your comments. So please feel free and ask me about anything you want to talk about, and we'll talk about it. So this idea of no mind came up, and she was asking about no mind. And she was saying that she had a period where it just all that kind of like the chatter in the brain just went away. And you could say that's no mind on a certain level, but the deepest meaning of no, and that's great. But the deepest meaning of no mind, well, back up. In India, they talk about elephants and sleeping elephants. A lot of times we can have stresses and strains and imperfections or whatever in our physiology and our psyche and all that. And they're like stampeding elephants. Sometimes they're stampeding, sometimes they're asleep. Either way, just because they're asleep doesn't mean they're not there. There's still purification that can go on. But for the period of time when all the chatter goes away and it's like a state of no mind, you might say that. But real no mind is when there are no elephants, no imperfections, no impurity. And what does that mean? Well, mind is what? It's a combination of karma, and most of our karma is in our hearts and between our ears. And it's a combination then of our karma with prana, life force that breathes up through us. Prana is life force, all the universe, and us also as individuals. So when prana and karma come together, it creates mind. And so the idea is that to really, on the deepest level, that no mind means no karma. No karma determining the nature of our thoughts. And I think particularly in Kali Yuga, it's probably best to look at that as a theoretical concept. Okay. But it sounds like she had a great experience here of no mind for a while, and that's great. And then she asked something. She said, "Do you think the creepy astral entities lie to us?" You can read what she wrote. As I'm understanding it, the idea is that, yeah, they do oftentimes lie to us, because what are they? They're the karma in oftentimes in personified form, dreams, boogeymen, channels that we speak to and think we're talking to God. all sorts of different astral entities out there. Even advice we get from other people and their astral influences. And so you don't have no idea who you're talking to, really. And that's an astral entity that can be profoundly negative, profoundly biased. And do they lie to us? Well, you better believe they do. They may not even think they're lying. Sometimes they do think they're lying. But truth is highly abstract, highly elusive, and almost always shrouded by what she called creepy astral entities to some degree. Okay. There's some nice quotes at the end here, Emerson, Kipling, like that. You can take a look at them. The one by Theodore Roosevelt kind of interested me. He said, in any moment of decision, the best thing you can do is the right thing, obviously. That we could talk about what right means in a field of relativity. The worst thing you could do is nothing. We could disagree with that, couldn't we? At the same time, there's a point to it. And that is that if you wait to know what the right thing to do absolutely certainly is, you'll never do anything, and then you'll never get anywhere. So there is a principle that says, put something out, see what comes back, and adjust accordingly. But put something out, do your best, and put it out and be prepared to adjust accordingly. We go from one shore to another in a sailboat, not in a straight line that we know exactly the direction to go. We tack, go this way, go that way, go this way, go that way, and finally get to the goal. Life is like that. We tack our way through our lives. Scotty, anything else? I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay, well, that was good. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will talk with you again next week on Ancient Secrets Revealed.